Well, it's a pleasure to be here today in this tremendously beautiful city. This is my second visit to it, and it's always marvelous to be here. My thanks go to my good colleague, Professor Islah Jad, who initially invited me to this forum, as she did something like about 2 or 3 years ago. Thank you very much. I was hoping to see her here, because part of the reason why I came here is to see her. But unfortunately, that is not to be. I want to thank very much my new colleagues that I have got to know here. I have my older colleagues from Birzeit. It's wonderful to see them again. But my 2 colleagues, specifically Magda Zeevold, who has been very patient and accommodating throughout several weeks. I must thank you very much for your hospitality and welcome. And for my new good colleague, Helmut Krieger, who was very kind in introducing me in the first place, maybe too kind, and for chairing this panel. I would like to begin my talk today with the assertion that the study of secularism has, ab initio, from the very beginning of its existence, been prejudiced, and that our treatment of it is not equal or at a par with our treatment of other topics, which is to say that on the whole, the treatment has been subjected to assumptions that prejudged secularism as an analytical matter at the very moment reflection on it had begun. As I come to secularism from 2 different fields, philosophy in its moral and political variants on the one hand, and Islamic studies on the other, it ceaselessly strikes me that secularism and Islamic studies, since they are actually at the very core of what we are doing here today, are not epistemologically equidistant. Scholarly narrative about secularism is far less descriptive than normative, creating the effect that secularism is critiqued when it is critiqued from within a worldview of secular values. This should not surprise. The very apparatus of our thinking is an Enlightenment apparatus, and the Enlightenment is nothing if it is not secular. This is not to say that when we speak of secularism, we do so from within a series of assumptions that take secularism to be a founding element of these assumptions, if not one of the most important founding elements. On the logical level, strictly, purely on the logical level, this involves a vicious argument that any logician will tell you it is just not going to work. Logicians call this a petitio principii, and they take it and throw it in the garbage can. On the more important level, this is a fatal epistemological error. For such arguments a priori preclude the detection of all sorts of problems, including contradictions and even ironies. The error becomes all the more obvious if we compare this method of treatment with the way we deal with Islam and the values that it generated and continues to generate. Obviously, almost nothing paradigmatic that is structurally meaningful about Islam or in Islam seems adequate, and nearly everything seems to appear wanting. It is always studied with what one might call counter premises, those that stand outside the system of the object being studied, and one that elicits responses which question the legitimacy, the very legitimacy of that system. And perhaps this is one of the major points that needs to be brought out at the outset, that the general paradigmatic discourse about secularism has ipso facto been geared toward legitimizing that doctrine. whereas the parallel discourse on Islam has had the opposite effects and fate altogether. This contrast is quite illustrative, as it pits two diametrically opposing discourses as double standards generated by the logic of one and the same enlightenment. Of course, it is not too difficult to understand why the study of secularism indulges in epistemological errors. If I assume, consciously or not, that in my study secularism is the default position, and always ask such questions as to whether this or that system has or has not succeeded in secularizing, then I am also assuming that my assumptions must be geared toward and are in fact embedded in a teleology. Which is also to say that my assumptions will also reshape and redefine the very questions I ask about other things, such as Islam and its values, such as about everything in the world. Which is to say that by predetermining the shape of my questions, I have already decided on the nature of my conclusions before I even begin to do any analytical work. The construction of secularism as foundational to the modern Western world and Islam as oppositional to that world, of course, has major cultural functions, including the construction of identity through opposition with some other. And there is nothing better than Islam for the West to draw itself against. Understanding that function, or attempting to understand it analytically as best as we could, makes for a second step, a genuine way to grasp things properly. The question that is also entailed here is this sufficient? Is it sufficient to conduct this analysis and reach this understanding? Or to put it more fully, is understanding deemed complete upon the stage what we call nowadays diagnostics? Is our understanding of secularism's functions sufficient for us to dispense fully with our duties as scholars? Is knowledge that which is about descriptive analytical or the descriptive analytical, or is it about the proper moral place of that knowledge which we garner, which is whatever its area may be? In yet other words, what is the epistemic value of morality in a proper descriptive analytical account? And if we do assent to this proposition as a valuable proposition, or at least an acceptable proposition, then what sort of morality are we speaking about here? I just said that the study of secularism has been normative and hardly descriptive, which prompts us to ask, what is the value system that is being advocated within this prejudice in favor of morality? Why not accept it as a valid system? And why not accept it in lieu of other systems? But then if we must engage in such questions, we might as well ask, by what standards can we judge secularism versus other systems to be valid, and by what philosophy? I do not mean to engage you today with all these questions. They require days and days of work. Obviously, they need much more time, but I do want to introduce them as essential to a complete or generally complete inquiry into secularism and, of course, to many other central issues. But on the whole, we must be prepared to ask profound and quote-unquote heretical questions. Not heretical against religion, heretical against anti-religion as well. We must be prepared to question whether in our system of secularism we have not incorporated a heavy dose of the sacred, that which cannot be understood except in terms of theology. We must be prepared to question the values of all norms, including those that we cherish and consider the foundations of our thinking. We must be prepared to question the very constitutive ingredients and component elements of the modern subject, asking, for instance, how the so-called Kantian autonomous rational subject has fared within a serious consideration of what the good life is. As you can see, I come to secularism from a critical perspective and what I call heretical perspective. I am one of the heretics. And therefore, and without being at all involved in any theological system. I mean, traditional theology. My background is a Greek Orthodox Christian of a Palestinian, that's at least my childhood upbringing. So when I talk to you about religion, believe me, I do not have stake in any of the traditional religions. But the bias but being critical of secularism is by definition also a biased position. So I'm not claiming objectivity here, because my fundamental premise is that there is no such thing. But my bias, I must insist, is not to be construed in any, to begin with, traditional sense, as I just said. My critical account, I should state at the outset, is purified of any theological consideration in the Christian, Muslim, or Buddhist sense. My argument in its full range is that secularism is not sustainable, because as its core and constitutive structures, it is epistemologically highly problematic and self-contradictory. It is, I argue, incoherent. I must emphasize at the same time that this does not translate into an endorsement of any particular existing system today. So I ask you to be patient with me in trying to expound a picture that will appear to you hopelessly fragmented itself. But I assure you that if we spend enough time together, it will not be as fragmented as you might think, because it is part of a larger conception of such issues, which I hope I will be able to finish before death approaches me. In other words, it's a very long project. Let me start from a modest place, a single proposition whereby I want to argue today that secularism is unsustainable due in part, and for now only in part, to its being fragmented and therefore fragmentary. As we know, secularism has had at least 2 centuries to show us that fragmentation. The persistence of fragmentation is not proven only by consistent historical evidence, but also by the very constitutive structures of secularism itself. Let me delve into the source of the problem, and I call it problem advisedly. Not an issue, a problem. Secularist manifestations of life have always existed in human society. Even in the most religious of cultures, some segments of society, and I have in mind also the Islamic culture in history, some segments of society, and especially segments of the political and economic elites, have led to what might be today called secular existence. But this is not the kind of secularism we are discussing here. The difference is a highly qualitative difference. Modern secularism is a paradigmatic ethos. It's a paradigmatic structural ethos built into our way of life, of our way of living. A society, ethos is a way a society on the whole configures, organizes, and lives its life, the way it sees the world. It is a paradigmatic ethos in that it is what Carl Schmitt called a central domain that defines other domains and is not defined by them. In this sense, secularism stands on a par and heavily intermeshes with such major projects of modernity as the nation-state, nationalism, capitalism, liberty, and its associated democratic values. But secularism is also, as I will later develop, the handmaiden of the modern concept of sovereignty. It is the handmaiden of the modern concept of sovereignty. And in this sense, secularism has been a constitutive project of modernity and an instrumental component of its political making. Put conversely, the elimination of secularism from the modern project will result in the collapse of the modern project as such, or, if given time, will lead to its profound and qualitative transformation. Due to very particular historical developments in Europe, a particular concept of sovereignty came into being, one that was specifically pitted against any non-anthropocentric source of power. The sovereignty of the modern European state was defined precisely in new theologically counter-theological terms. Terms that rejected traditional metaphysics in favor of new ones. This is not to say that the new sovereignty of the modern state, or the sovereignty of popular will, because the modern state is a nation state, has amended or cancelled a theology or a metaphysic in favor of what we popularly call a scientific or a rationalist view of the world. By no means. And that would be a great mistake to think so. This is, for my argument, is that the secular has been part and parcel of a sort of religious substitution, where one theology or metaphysic is replaced by another. Of course, it is legitimate to argue that no theology should have a historical monopoly, and that it is natural for religions, like empires, to rise and fall. And so the modern state's theology is merely that latest wave of theologies, and thus it is no less of a theology than any other. My larger argument, which certainly I will not attempt to demonstrate here, but I have to mention it, is that this latest theology is the least convincing of all. For a historian of religion like myself, I find it less convincing than other theologies. And this is coming from a fairly secularist person. And that it is not only unconvincing, but that it is unsustainable because it rests on incoherent and hesitant, not to mention short-sighted foundations. Or to put it more precisely, because it rests on what might be called phenomenological will, that shifting will of the human agent, the Kantian rational subject. It is the will of the here and now, of the short term of things in the world, of immediate interest and gains. If not immediate gain and profit in the most crude sense of the language. The secular is merely one aspect of this new theology, and as such it reflects the same problematics of its coherence, of its incoherence. Being all this, then, secularism was born out of fragmentation. For without that fragmentation, it would not have arisen in the first place. And let me be clear about what I mean by fragmentation. I do not mean by it having something split asunder. That is true too. But fragmentation here is the tearing apart of an organic piece from a certain body, a piece that makes the body whole and sound, which I must emphasize does not mean perfect. Things don't have to be perfect to work, but they work, and they work as a cohesive system. Fragmentation is the rendering of something as incomplete, closer to describing it as lacking a unity of vision, as conflicted, as existing in an epistemologically shattered world. Fragmentation, and between brackets I can add, lack of a unified vision, was essential to secularism's birth. I am referring to the fundamental Enlightenment distinction between the is and the ought, a distinction which has permeated in the most complex of ways the fiber of modern moral philosophy. In fact, we not only live by it, but we cannot live without it now, all of us. As Charles Taylor has cogently argued, the is-ought separation, and with it the fact-value split, have become, in his words, and I quote him, a dominant theme in modern philosophy, and has undergirded a new understanding and valuation of freedom and dignity. End of quote. This is also why the modern, again I quote him, the modern meta-ethic of fact-value dichotomy does not stand as a timeless truth, at last discovered in the way we have come to discover, for example, scientific phenomena. It makes sense only within certain ethical outlooks, end of quote. But the fact is that it was, like much else in modernity, made to be a sort of a timeless and moreover universal truth, designed, as Taylor adds, and I quote him here, to outrageously fix the rules of discourse in the interests of one outlook, forcing rival views, meaning the unity of existence, into incoherence. End of quote. The outrageousness of this state of affairs stems not only from biases involved in the suppression of competing philosophical narratives, but also from the distinct likelihood of its being entirely false. Both Taylor and Alasdair MacIntyre have advocated the contingent, contextual nature of this split, and have argued, and I quote, that no moral reasoning can do without modes of thinking which the split rules out. You cannot do without it. You cannot reflect on anything that has to do with our behavior, since we are searching what a good life should be without this kind of thinking, which has dominated philosophy since Aristotle, if not before. Moreover, in some juristic circles, it has been recognized that nearly absolute distinction between is and ought has generated and aggravated the crisis in American and European legal theory. Needless to say, the crises occur in many other fields, not excluding, of course, economics, business, medicine, and much else that is important to all modern societies. I do not need to dwell too long on the effects of this distinction, a distinction that has the dubious status of being the first, most powerful and destructive to be ever made in recorded human history. If we follow back the problems of modernity in their major form, those major problems that are everyone recognizes as problems that we all have to deal with, they ultimately go back to this distinction, the distinction between the is and the ought. The effects of the distinction are summed up in our story, the story of modernity and of the modern project. We can enumerate several effects: subjugating nature and denuding it of all its value, destroying it, being only the most obvious effects that I think almost every one of us nowadays recognizes. This is no doubt the greatest story of abuse ever known to us. Matter is thereby rendered brute, inert, and even stupid. And I'm quoting these terms because Boyle himself quoted them, used them. I wonder if I were talking about the Sharia and chopping off hands, so many people would leave the audience. All in spiritual agencies or the anima would be banished from the universe, rendering matter spiritually meaningless, by now relevant in an anthropocentric, materialistic sense. If matter exists in a brute and inert form, then the only reason for its existence, natural matter, the only reason then would be for its existence is its service to man. It should not be surprising then that as of this time, leading European thought as of end of 17th, beginning of the 18th century, began to see nature as the object of man and his knowledge. That is a dumb and manipulable object. The modern state and its sovereign will represented in the law was not only an integral part of this worldview, but also was one of its chief architects. Philosophy since Schopenhauer has taught us that there is no human perception of the world that is denuded of will, of the will, an interest, a desire, a vital striving, a drive, of all sorts of ways. This is a valuative will, which has no choice but to enter every conceivable idea, every idea we might entertain. Every age, being unique and providing a context, gives rise to different world views, a different thought structure, which is the basis of all realistic thinking about the world. Max Scheler offered us the profound insight that since the Renaissance, the Western worldview or thought structure has been underlined, if not produced, by an a priori will whose predominant concern, and I am more or less paraphrasing here, whose predominant concern is to dominate nature, control it, transform it, subjugate it, and very importantly for us, sever it ontically and ontologically, psychologically and spiritually from our systems of value. Hence the distinction between the is and the ought and its importance for us. Thus, domination over nature, but ironically and necessarily within nature, became a decisive axiological framework, as well as the contextual value system without which no study of reality can be conducted meaningfully. And from this axiological background grew the Euro-American modern worldview. This is precisely where secularism was born. Secularism was born out of a new conception of power and domination, which is systematic and self-perpetuating, but as well as systemic. Understanding this genealogy is of the essence. Representing a new form of sovereignty, the modern state was developed in the soil of the separation of fact and value, a soil that recognized power based on pure facts of science, what Nietzsche called brute facts, as the only form of power. It became the Schellerian power of the pure will. Secularism is therefore as much the offspring of the state as it is the offshoot of the distinction between the is and the ought. Secularism thus comes apart as a fragmented entity because it was stripped of its holistic background of value. Or rather, I should say, it is the result of this operation of stripping. As a mode of governance, and thus as dependent on what has been called brute facts, secularism does not admit except that which is verifiable and quantifiable. Of course, values cannot be measured, and therefore they are rejected. Secularism accepts only that which is verifiable and quantifiable. Anything that cannot be quantified, measured, and or verified cannot be the basis of action, and therefore must be jettisoned, including such spheres as religion. Hence, this is one of the reasons, one important reason why secularism cannot accept religion in the traditional sense. This is precisely why secularism is said to be indeterminate. Indetermination is the function of the internal disunity and internal fragmentation. I think it is not too much risk to say that a fragmented subject can never produce solidly cohesive or integrally unified effects. This sounds to me both a logical and epistemological impossibility. If the main business of secularism is to keep religion, quote unquote, protected in the private sphere, a myth, as we will see soon, then we ought to evaluate it on this ground, namely the division between the public and the private spheres. What we find here is pure indeterminacy, where the line of separation between these two spheres keeps shifting according to contingency. In other words, it is an ad hoc line, exposing indeterminacy as secularism's paradigmatic feature. In other words, it is its middle name, if I were to put it in another way. One of the remarkable contributions of Hussein's Agram's new book is the delineation of the thesis that it is in the indeterminacy of this divine line that secularism exists or rests. But I'm not entirely sure that this indeterminacy has been sufficiently connected to not only to the concept of state sovereignty, which he tries to do, by the way, but not enough, in my opinion. but also to the Schmittian concept of the political, including the decision on the exception. I cannot accept this indeterminacy as an a priori modus vivendi or modus operandi on the secular, of the secular. This indeterminacy, whereby the boundaries of the private sphere may endlessly continue to shift, is the hallmark of the contingencies of the political, where no argument can fix any discourse permanently, and no principle, especially a moral principle, can control the behavior of any social group. For any such moral argument turns out to be at the end nothing but a political argument. Moral fixity is never to be had. Secular power, therefore, is integral to the political, and as such, and like the political, it has no teleology beyond itself. If this is the case, then the subject's inner will and constitution, his self and subjectivity, cannot be the measure of the law or of any regulatory social mechanism. To be feasible and legitimate, such mechanism must originate from factual, empirical verification and quantification, namely externally objective laws that are legislated by experts to regulate the outer behavior of the subjects by means of coercion or the threat of it, which is precisely where we live today. As the substance of legislation, secularism thus does not attend to what Foucault called the technologies of the self, those inner but also self-imposed technologies that train the soul and regulate it from within. Why can't secularism furnish the individual and with him society with such a strategy? Answering this question, I think, will sharpen our argument as to secularism's fragmented and fragmenting nature. First, secularism, I argue, does not make it its business to engage in the spiritual and moral constitution of the individual. And of that, in fact, many citizens of the modern state or nation state are proud, because this freedom is precisely intended to provide an antidote to the need for such technology. This is often seen as precisely the juncture where individual freedom and the Kantian autonomous rationality reside. Being interested in the here and now, the business of secularism is essentially regulating social life while maintaining absolute loyalty to the very principle of regulation and domination. It is integral to the state and its sovereignty, and as such, it must be loyal to the sources of power, which is to say, power as constantly adjustable collection of forces and force fields, to use Foucault's term, whose aim is governance, rule, and to some extent, domination for the sake of domination. Beyond these, there is no meaning to secularism. Or put in a more restricted way, secularism is structurally not in the business of providing moral meaning and moral education to the state subject. It is as much interested in all of this as the state is, which is to say, not interested at all. The modern state cannot be construed on ethical grounds. This is, by the way, in my opinion, that's why Hegel's theory of the state miserably failed, because it's based, unlike all other philosophical theories advocated in the Enlightenment, it's based on moral foundations. And that's why his theory was considered as a nice dream, but a dream nonetheless. So, as I said, the modern state cannot be construed on ethical grounds, nor can it ontologically operate as a moral entity. As Iris Murdoch once said, the state, I quote her, does not seek to enter the moral realm, nor is it its duty, I quote her again, to make us good. It aims to make us good only in the sense of becoming loyal citizens, which is to say that we become what general governance wants the citizen to become, whether it be the enhancement of a traditional value cast anew or the invention of a new value. But none of these values, old and new, are adopted as guiding moral principles, but rather as instrumentalities, another middle name of the Enlightenment. And as Carl Schmitt aptly argued, any moral argument adduced in politics and in the framework of state domination is, in the final analysis, nothing but a political argument, a way to legitimize what he called political ambition. I do not wish to enter upon the arguments for and against the desirability of the state and its subordinate secular organ in engaging such projects as creating moral subjects. That's a bit outside of our purview today. The arguments are plenty on both sides, although I must say that most of these do not possess a long view. Another way of saying they are short-sighted. But I do not want to enter here because this will distract us further from a direct confrontation with secularism itself. The point I wish to make is that the segregation of the is from the ought has had the effect of neutering social structures and group social values of their anchors, which is precisely what the state intended to do in the first place. We tend to overlook the fact that the liberal project is nothing more than a successful engineering project, different only in one respect from the one that the socialists and communists attempted early in the 20th century, namely that liberalism succeeded, but communism failed, and failed miserably. The normalization of liberalism should not hide the fact that it was a social engineering project of monumental proportion, one that changed the face of Euro-America and now is in the process of doing the same for the rest of the world, or at least most of it. It is important to look at such phenomena with a fresh eye and avoid the epistemic trap of normalization. We tend to see the rise of individual and civil liberty and its Kantian rationalist equivalent as an accomplishment for the agenda of freedom, which is exactly the discursive ploy deployed and harnessed in order to strip the individual of his and her group support. The organic community, the group communal solidarity and structured constitution, and the dominant world phenomena of self-rule, which was quite robust in Asia, Africa, and the Americas before European hegemony, all were incompatible with the mode of governance of the modern European state. These props had to be stripped away, and one intention was to isolate the individual and render him the subject of state loyalty. And here I'm entering on a very fundamental point that might touch on some of the discussions I have heard today, and that I know that interests you directly. Now, even the nuclear family is in crisis, leaving the social order to rest on the individual, or perhaps better named, the citizen. The archaeology of secularism must therefore account for such questions as to why, when the neo-Roman liberty defenders rose up in Britain and Europe around the 17th century, they did not choose the local community or any social group or collectivity as the locus of rights, but instead they chose the individual. This is something we take for granted. In fact, I don't know anyone who asks this question. Why did, when the English theoreticians and their French equivalent later on began to discuss the issue of civil liberty and individual rights, and rights as such, why didn't they think of any model except the individual model? Obviously, we are much more imaginative. We can find other ways of solving our problems. As they say, there are always several ways to, let's not use this example. I was going to say skin a cat, but I had to say it. So why is it that one that we have chosen? they have chosen. That is subject to reflection. I raise these issues only to highlight the method of governance that secularism developed. And here it is worth repeating that we have no way of truly understanding secularism unless we treat it as organically integral to sovereignty. Secularism is a method of state governance, and as such, subject to both normative law and the Schmittian state of the exception. It is certainly a method that intends to fragment, because this is how the state must rule. Any social or political formation that is not loyal in its relevant constitution to the operative imperatives of the modern state must be broken up to accommodate the configuration of that state and its priorities. Any social formation, whether a clan, a tribe, or any organization that demands its own loyalty, is deemed a threat, and thus gradually, if not abruptly, must be broken up by the power of the sovereign. The state cannot live with competing loyalties, no more than it can live under any other's rule, hence the meaning of its sovereign will. That's exactly what sovereignty is. But of course, I am seeing it from ugly ways that most people don't choose to see it. So secularism cannot be understood as a neutral mode of governance, as if it is not entangled in some form of metaphysics. In fact, it is, and profoundly so. Secularism is a method of state governance that has as much to do with religion, for example, as anything else. It has to do with theology in at least two ways, and I will discuss these ways and get out of my lecture for today. I have more to say, but I notice that I'm running a bit beyond time. It has to do with one directly with traditional religion and its reconfiguration, and another with creating a new theology or a new metaphysics, if you will. I think the empirical instances of the first way of theologizing secularism are fairly well known. Secularism determines both the form and content of religion in the ever-increasing space of the public sphere. It decides on what is acceptable and unacceptable forms of religious practice. And this may not be restricted to the public sphere. The fact that family law and much of what we consider as belonging to the private sphere is subject to state legislation amounts, in fact, not only to the most effective mechanism for social re-engineering, but also, and no less, to a theological determination of the religious constitution of the public sphere. As part of the modern state's metaphysics, secularism, to borrow from Schmidt's conception, is a new God who decides for its subjects what to do. Maybe not to believe, but what to do. Enforced efficiently, substantive laws and rules do have the effect of engendering conformity to normative standards. And these, if applied persistently, our laws that we see every day, if applied persistently, would lead in good time to unquestioning acceptance. Hence, the good citizen who is a paradigmatic citizen in Europe is simply a citizen who bought the story of the state. The reason why Muslim and African countries are called rogue states is because their subjects have not yet entered into this buying game of accepting the will of the state as their own. As I said earlier, there is an antinomy between the familiar and genuine understanding. For the more normal and familiar a thing is rendered, the less it is likely to be subject to reflection and critique. And so are the laws of our state. It should not be surprising then that with persistent legislation over 2 or 3 generations, these rules of practice translate into tenets and creeds in the minds of the citizens. Which brings us to the second point, or rather the second point in which secularism indulges in metaphysics. And it is as it is well recognized in studies of nationalism, the national subject is formed by what we now consider as routine and mundane ways of life. Daily routine, schools and colleges and universities, round-the-clock exposure to state slogans, symbols, laws, rituals, and what have you. All these nurture the citizen, who reaches what I call a paradigmatic state of citizenry when he sees himself or herself as not only the protected subject of his state or her state, but also as willing and ready to kill or be killed for his state's sake. This is the ultimate measure. And this is where political theology resides today, is in this phenomenon that we take for granted. We don't even think about it twice. But imagine that the most sacred gift we can have, the most important thing for us, all of us, is our own lives. That's the most important thing. There is nothing more dear to life than life itself. And that becomes the object, the only important object actually of sacrifice for the modern state. And what I can go on and on, but I want to show you one point here. And using the issue of sacrifice I would think is a paradigmatic, extremely important point, which is that the secularism as part of the state is given a new theology, a new metaphysic, by the fact that we are willing to die for it. Like soldiers, American soldiers go fight in Afghanistan and Iraq to protect the American way of life. What is the American way of life? Among other things, it's secular penchant. After all, in Afghanistan, we go there to destroy the Taliban. Why? Because we want to propound democracy. And secularism is entrenched in all of these concepts. So we die for the sake of secularism. And there is nothing worth of death unless it is for gods. And secularism has become a god. I have much more to say, but I think I exhausted my at least 40 minutes. And, but I would like to also leave the floor open, not only for questions about secularism, but I notice that you have interest in some Islamic issues, which I am dying to address if you are interested. Thank you very much.